Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to just once more look at how the people of this world have thought through this challenge of knowing God, how to live life, what is the meaning and purpose of life, how do we wrestle with the reality of God and humanity and sin and love and truth. How do we deal with the realities of those around us who believe something different than we believe? How do we negotiate that, Father? How do we do it in a way that pleases you, that listens and loves, but also makes good decisions and learns to discern truth from falsehood? So, Father, through all of this, we are dependent upon the illumination of your Spirit as we sincerely try to understand the truth that you've revealed in your word and through your creation. And so, Father, we ask this in the name of Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. Well, thank you for coming. Again, we're in the section on Judaism, and we're looking at session number 3. So far, we've worked through the first 1,000 years. If you weren't here last week, we covered 1,000 years in an hour and a half. So it was a fast journey. All right, so the goal here is to pick up at that 1,000-year mark, that first millennium, and take us another 700 years. Next week, we'll come back and talk about the year 1700 to the present, just so we get a full sweep of history, and then we'll spend some time talking about belief and practice and so forth. So before we jump into this session 3, though, there were a few slides we didn't get to last week from session 2, and they kind of set the table for the second 1,000 years, if you will, or at least the 1,000 years since in the Common Era. So we want to go and look at that end of the Common Era. How did that look? And that last section was on what we call the medieval diaspora. And diaspora is this word that means the scattered. Remember, as Israel grew up through most of its ancient period, it was around that city of Jerusalem, through that area of Israel, in and out of that land. We went through the Babylonian captivity, where many of those Jewish folks were carried away into Babylon, and so now there's a center of Jewish life in around Babylonia. There's still the remaining now, after they returned, there's a center of Judaism in and around the Middle East. But as the years went on, as the centuries went on, as the empires one gave way to another, Jewish people began to move all over that Mediterranean area and beyond. And so what we want to look at here in that as we got close to the 1000 CE, there is this wide divergence of Jewish population. How did it get there? Where did it go? And then that will be a platform that we use to look at the second 1,000 years. So just to pick up this quote here, remember we left at the end of the last kind of study, we talked about this tremendous scattering of the Muslim empire and how that empire kind of took off very quickly, spread all the way from Spain in the west, all the way to like Afghanistan and India in the east, moving north. And so it turns out that the Jewish populations kind of filled in throughout this empire. And so we have this quote from one of the scholars. It says, by the 10th century, that is the beginning of 1000, the year 1000, 1100 in there, the rabbinic forms of Judaism that we just went through and looked at had begun to develop in Mesopotamia and Palestine. That's the area of ancient Israel. And by the way, Palestine was kind of a Latin word imposed on this area. It basically means land of the Philistines. And so it's kind of this Roman judgment kind of term that said this is not the land of Israel, this is the land of the Philistines, the Palestine. That was the word that was used to describe that area. Not particularly Jewish friendly. But anyway, that's what the scholar uses. This word Palestine in late antiquity had spread far beyond those regions and taken root in this huge swath of land from Iberia, which is in the west, modern Spain and Portugal, to Khorasan, which is Persia, what we know as Iraq. In that sense, Islamic rule not only transformed Judaism, but enabled its consolidation and diffusion. In other words, as Islam began to take over these huge territories throughout the known world, it actually kind of created a situation where Judaism followed it throughout the world. And we're going to see how that works itself out. And not just the Islamic area, but up into the Christian reigned territories as well. So how does this look in terms of maps? Well, you can see all over the place. And it's in this period that we begin to get different flavors of Judaism that began to develop. Different kind of, the same basic ideas, same basic teachings, same basic roots in rabbinic Judaism, but different interpretations, different dress, different outlooks, different traditions began to spawn, and different terms. And so you kind of see these two large groups that are going to form an important part of medieval Jewish discussion. One is this group called the Ashkenazim, the Ashkenazi Jews. They kind of emerge in what's called the Rhineland, and now in modern, what we would consider modern Germany, into France. It's more the European Jewish communities began to develop. And what we're going to see as they began to develop, as persecution and other thing comes, they start to spread themselves out of kind of Western Europe, Northern Europe, and they start to flow into Central and Eastern Europe, and we're going to see how that progression takes place. Another group of Jewish tradition begins to form in the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, and all the way down into northern Africa, and we call that group, or that family of Jewish followers, Sephardim. So there you have these two kind of big general terms talking about two different regional influences and flavors or pictures or traditions of Judaism: Ashkenazi Judaism and Sephardic Judaism. So those two different groups. And then, of course, you still have a strong contention of Middle Eastern Jewish people staying right there where they were. So there's still a population there. So you began to see this spreading of Judaism throughout the known area, but also, while it stays in some states constant and sharing a common tradition, they're also in flux, changing in different areas and in different ways. Another important development of this switch to this kind of this diaspora, the spreading of Judaism all over this area, is we have different powers of authority, different powers or authority. And with the spreading of these different groups, you begin to have this institution known as the yeshiva, the academy, the center of learning. And that yeshiva becomes not just a school that you send people to, but it's a center of authority and scholarship, almost like a court, a law court, for these different populations. And so you have the yeshiva being kind of a center of authority in each of these communities as they're spread throughout the community. Again, remember, the temple is gone. There's now these other local authorities that become the ruling group or the authoritative group. And at the head of these various yeshiva schools is this officer called the Gaon. And the Gaon was kind of like the president of that yeshiva. Well, what begins to happen is that the academies in the whole Babylonian area, where we would know as current-day Iran and Iraq, that area, they kind of rise to prominence in two schools in particular, in Sarah and Pempunita. Those are two important Ashkenazic schools that began to exert authority far beyond their authority in their region. So to the extent that the Sephardic Jews in northern Africa even looked to these yeshivas in that area. So we have these Geonim that began to exert authority outside of their region. So I just list those here to let you know, and it's a flavor of what it was like to live in the diaspora. The authority was no longer, look, what did Jerusalem say? You had another whole court of these Geonim leaders that are there dictating what does the law mean. So if you had a practical question about whether I could divorce this person or whether I could enter in this business agreement or in the conflict between the two business agreements, who was going to go back through the Jewish law and look at what they called the halakha, all the Jewish traditions and laws, who's going to go back through that and make a decision on one side to another? Which Jewish court had the authority? Is it the Jewish court, yeshiva, in Palestine or in Jerusalem, in Israel, or would it be this group in and around these two schools of Sarah, for example? Well, it turns out that for much of the diaspora and for a period of time, it's actually the group in the Babylon area that gets to be authoritative. So just a sign of the times, the fact that there's multiple powers scattered throughout the known world. Another major thing that happens in these early Middle Ages as we get to that turn of that first millennium is this spreading of the medieval merchant. One of the things that starts to happen as Jewish people began to scatter themselves all over this Mediterranean world and beyond is they fit into society and they find ways to make money. And it's difficult sometimes in some places, depending upon how the local governments allow them to make money. They have to find ways to make money, and often they weren't allowed to own territory, they weren't allowed to own land, they weren't allowed to be farmers anymore, and so they began to find niches that they could serve. And oftentimes there is an urbanization tendency here, that they're moving into the cities and finding jobs in banking or in trade or in the trades or in the craft industry. Well, there is this huge group called the Radhanites. And these folks were amazing merchants. And they developed this incredible network of trade routes all the way from the west to the east. And we see reference to them periodically through other places. They had put together this international trade route way before we had Marco Polo or any of those guys. They had established these international trade routes by sea and by land, camels, all the rest. They had this amazing ability to take teas and spices and everything from India and beyond and bring them west, take Western goods and carry them east. They kind of had almost this system worked out. And they used the postal routes, the paper manufactured by Arabs in the Muslim world, the postal routes that established by the Arab world, all kinds of systems set up by these huge swaths of lands now controlled by Muslims. They used those territories to develop these incredible marketing networks. And so they're all over the world. So that's another advantage or another change. On the one hand, it's a very bad thing, obviously, that the temple gets destroyed and all this oppression in medieval places. It scatters the Jewish folks everywhere. But that actually, in the long run, became this. They used that misfortune to turn them into this incredible marketing power force all the way through the known world. So very resourceful, very inventive, and, by the way, turning out to be quite wealthy, even if quite dangerous. See, one of the problems is they established all this, but it wasn't unknown for local leaders to take it from them, and then they have to go get it again. It wasn't exactly a safe environment, but somehow, among all the different traders that were going on, this Jewish network of Radhanites were able to negotiate this huge international trade route early on by the 10th century. And here's another quote from a scholar that kind of builds on that, this idea that these technologies, the paper, the postal system, the codex, we didn't talk about that, the fact that now there's a bound book, it's not all these individual scrolls, they're putting this together. And while they were kind of developed in the Islamic culture, the Jewish folks apportioned that, took that to themselves, and turned it to their advantage and created this amazing merchant community. And lastly, it's also verified through this other collection, and this is something I'll just point out to you so that when you hear it and see it, you'll know what it's about. They discovered in... I'm forgetting exactly. I think it was in the 18th century. They discovered this treasure trove of documents in what's called the Geniza outside of Cairo. The Geniza is just a storage closet. And they found in this storage room, they found over 300,000, some say 330,000 manuscripts in there in all kinds of languages. Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and other languages. They found these documents just crammed in there. Some of them were manuscripts of sacred texts like the Talmud or like the Quran and different documents. But what was most interesting to scholars is not just those documents, but there were a lot of documents about average, ordinary prices of things, wages that are being paid, letters from different folks. And this has kind of opened up the whole world of that mid-10th century, 11th century. In fact, there are documents there from the 9th all the way up to the 19th century. But predominantly that early medieval period, all these average, ordinary documents that pulled back. Now, most of them are now, I think, in Cambridge Library in England or in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Those are kind of where most of them are, but they're in other places. I think there's some in America, the Jewish seminary there. They're scattered around, but the idea is that these documents, people can go to them and see that there was this rich culture all the way throughout this medieval world, Jewish culture. So we're going to kind of pick up from there, and you can see this is kind of the stage that is set as we move from the year 1000 into the 11th century. So let's switch that page now and look at this session, what we want to pick up. So you switch to the new document that I handed out, and we're going to talk today about the spread of that from this year 1000, and we'll probably go, I'll try to get somewhere around the year 1700 by the end of the class. So not quite so tough. Last time we had to do 1,000 years in an hour and a half. This week I only have to do 700 years, so we can go a little slower, right? Okay, so let's switch, and I want to kind of see this section, this medieval period, if you will, of Judaism. Two major emphases. One is a whole new layer of sacred literature produced during this medieval period. And then we want to look at another wave, if you will, of persecutions, expulsions, and migrations. So that's what we're going to do through the balance of this session. First then, let's look at the new sacred literature. And here's, again, one scholar's observation, all this, a quote I put in there for you. In the centuries of the Middle Ages, the great thinkers of the Judaic tradition completely reshaped Jewish civilization. In other words, this is a major turning point. This is a whole new layer of scholarship put on top of what the rabbis have done to this point. And we're going to see that much of the work that these thinkers put in to the development of Jewish thought is still around today and still used today. So the first person we want to look at is a fellow by the name of Rashi. His dates there are there. Rashi is kind of this short form of Rabbi Shlomo Ishaki, and that's what kind of abbreviated, it's now Rashi. Originally from France, spent times in different places, but ultimately spent in this area of France. And he is known as kind of this towering figure in rabbinic thought and in commentary. He's still with us. People believe, in fact, I have a quote here. It says, Jews of all ages and persuasions still seek their weekly guidance and inspiration from Rashi's commentary to the Torah. And Rashi remains the primary exponent of the Talmud, the core of Judaism's vast intellectual heritage. This is still seen as the expert, the authority on how to interpret Talmud, how to interpret Torah. So his writings are still used in studies as we are about to see. All kinds of tremendous stories about his birth. You know, there's these legends that grow up to kind of emphasize how important he was. One of the legends have to do with the fact that his father was this jewel merchant. And he found this incredibly valuable diamond. And he found some businessman that was willing to buy this diamond. If he could just make this sale, he would be set to life, tremendously valuable. But then he found out that this businessman was going to take this diamond and turn it and put it in an idol to another god in his house. And Rashi's father decides, no, I can't do it. I can't do this sale. If this diamond's going to end up in this idol, I'm going to throw it in the deep part of the sea. So Rashi's father takes this valuable diamond and throws it in the ocean. So the legend goes. And then God speaks to the father and says, you threw away one jewel and I will give you another. And the jewel he gives him is his son Rashi. Right? Another story, just Jewish tradition filled with these wonderful stories. His mother is being chased by a wild camel while she's pregnant with Rashi. And she runs from the camel, and just as the camel is coming near, she turns around and puts herself face first into a wall to protect herself from the onrush of the camel. And so the legend goes, the wall moved to accommodate her pregnant body to save Rashi. So that's the story. So whether, take your grain of salt about how historical you think those legends are, but they developed to show how important and how esteemed and what a treasure they believed Rashi to be. So why is he so important? Well, he writes these commentaries on the Torah and the Talmud. And I have a picture here that you will see on this slide. And the way this works is Rashi, and I think this is of the Talmud, but he did similar things to the Torah. What he does is he takes the text and he lays it out. And you can see on this slide, it's the middle, this is the Talmud, so it's the middle section, I just colored in green there so you can see how this thing is laid out. There is this, in the middle you have the Talmud, and we learned earlier from an early tradition, that's the Mishnah, that's the original rabbinic commentary. And then the comments on the comments, which is the Gemara, that's the original Talmud, so that's in the middle. And so what Rashi did is he took this Talmud and he wrote little statements on it, little comments, brief, concise comments on each line of the Talmud in this case. And part of the problem with the Talmud at this point, to try to read it and understand it, you really have to be an expert. This was before you had Google. And you could just go in and say, show me everything in the Talmud on marriage, or show me everything in the Talmud about sacrifice. This was before you had Google. So, and there was no index to this thing. You couldn't say, go to the 15th volume or the 21st volume and find out all the mentions of marriage. No, the only way to know where all this stuff was is to just know the Talmud. Spend your whole life studying it and then go to somebody who really knows and they say, oh, there's a tractate about this over here in this particular part of the Talmud. So what Rashi did is go through the Talmud, for example, and he goes through and he lists out all the places and all the essential comments on all the way through there so that you could kind of understand what was going on. If you pick up the Talmud or the Mishnah and you just try to read it, and I showed you a couple quotes of those the other week when we went through it, on the surface they're really hard to understand. It's like somebody's talking another language and you walked into the middle of the story. I mean, that's the feeling you get when you try to read this stuff. And so Rashi just went through this amazing, he just had this encyclopedic brain where he'd go through and he'd kind of give you a commentary on that, a guide, a handout for each one of these major sections. So you'd look, for example, at the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud in the middle, and then what began to happen in generations that followed Rashi, the publications of the Talmud had his commentary built into it. So that blue text on the right, as you look at the slide, which is your, let's see, it'd be your right, yeah, the blue stuff. That's Rashi's commentary. So when you got a copy of the Talmud, you automatically got Rashi's commentary, right? So that was just standard practice. Some of you remember the good old Scofield Reference Bible. Do you remember that? Some of you kind of grew up in that area. So when you got the Bible, you also got all the Scofield notes. They just came with it. Well, what happened over centuries is when you got the Talmud, after a while, you got Rashi's comments with it. And to this day, I was just out there looking to verify this. To this day, there's kind of primary level kind of classes out there, video classes that say, okay, this is how you read the Talmud. Here's the Mishnah, here's the Gemara, and over here is Rashi's commentary. And they still teach Rashi's commentary because he does such an amazing job of taking some of these complex issues and boiling it down. Now, it's written in Hebrew, usually in a different script. The block script for the Talmud, and then they actually have a script named after him called Rashi script. It's in a different kind of, he didn't invent it, but they call it Rashi script, and it's kind of written in another way so you can see his commentary. So after Rashi, he had sons, well, actually he had daughters, from what I understand. But his daughters married to son-in-laws who had grandchildren, and those son-in-laws and grandchildren began to write commentaries as well. And they wrote commentaries on Rashi's commentaries. So you're getting kind of deep into the commentary, right? You have the Torah, which was the written scripture, the Tanakh. Then you had the early rabbis commenting. That's called the Mishnah. You had the commentaries on the Mishnah called the Gemara. Then you had Rashi commenting on the Mishnah and the Gemara. And then you got other people commenting on Rashi, who was commenting on Gemara, who was commenting. So the layer of commentary is getting deep here. And you can begin to see why people now spend their whole lifetime studying the Talmud, because there's all kinds of layers. Well, this last layer is called the Tosafot. Those are the layers in addition to, on top of, the Rashi commentary. And that's now printed on your left in that, I think, what did I put that in? Purple? So that's the Tosafot. That is the comments on Rashi's commentary. And that is a little bit more fluid, a little bit more excursive. And what's interesting about those comments, and some of them come right from his own in-laws, his son-in-laws and grandchildren, they're often disagreeing with Rashi. I mean, they don't have any problem with disagreeing. But kind of the farther back you get to the beginning, the more authentic the witness. But you're able to dialogue. Now, what's interesting when you read Rashi is he often doesn't give you his opinion. It's very rare that he gives you his opinion. He just points out the different opinions to that point, and sometimes he would weigh in on his thought this way or that way. People debate. There's all kinds of debate about what he actually believes sometimes because of the way he does his commentary. But the Tosafot, they were very clear. They made their commentary known, especially if there were differences of opinion. And that really became the essence of debate. If some of the ancient scholars believe this way or that way and there's a difference of opinion, well, who is right? They can go through the agreement or go through the argument. So Rashi becomes very important. And for the first time, now you have this summary of Talmud, some sort of version of this getting your handle around what the Talmud really said, a way of kind of bridging the gap between all the language and all the material that's been written there for centuries. How can we begin to distill it and use it and apply it to our everyday life? Well, Rashi's a very big part of that tradition. Also, in this period, you begin to get some philosophic influence. And we're going to see as the Middle Ages unfold, more of this interchange with the philosophies of the world, and how is the philosophies of the world going to intersect with Judaism. And we'll see this all the way through the Middle Ages, right up into the current day. And so, in some ways, kind of the beginning of this migration into philosophy, or at least reaction to it, you have Judah, depending on what version of the woods you come from, Yehuda Halevi. He's a formative figure in setting forth and dealing with how Judaism and philosophy come together. Now, the truth is, Halevi, if you really look at his works, he's primarily a poet. I mean, he was a prolific poet, written many, many beautiful poems that are repeated to this day, and some about Jerusalem. He's from Spain and spent his whole life in another place, and then at the end of his life tried to get back to Jerusalem and goes back to Israel, and kind of his final words, so to speak, or some people say, is in his poetry, trying to get, in some ways they call him kind of this proto-Zionist, just this love for Israel. So a very poetic figure, but also a physician. He made his money through being a physician. And I guess that's the other thing maybe I should point out. A lot of these scholars, it's not like they got paid to be a scholar. A lot of these folks we're going to read, they were physicians or they were merchants. Rashi was a merchant that his business ran, and he just did this on the side. Halevi, he was a physician, did this on the side. So a lot of these folks had jobs. They couldn't just, so they were, most of them insomniacs. They worked all day, dealt with people, and then they come home and stayed up all night and read the Talmud. Just amazing, dedicated people. And a lot of his writings, a lot of that poetry, still appears in pieces of liturgy. Now, his best-known work is this work called Kuzari, which we're going to look at, originally written in Arabic. And that's really where you get into more of the philosophy side of Halevi. He basically uses as a premise of this work a time in Jewish history, very short period of time in Jewish history, where it is generally believed now, it was doubted at some point, but there's generally believed that there was this brief period of time where there was a nation in and around Kiev in the Middle Ages that for a brief period of time actually converted to Judaism. That is, a whole kingdom, a pagan nation, so to speak, not believing in any of the traditions. For some reason, we're not really sure how that worked, but for some brief period of time, it seems that at one level or another, the kingdom converted to Judaism, and for some brief period of time, there is this kingdom that is at some level, Khazari kingdom that was at some level Judaic. But many years later, now Halevi is using that historical tradition, and he builds on it, and he writes the story. And the legend kind of said that, how did this kingdom become Judaic? Why did they accept? So the legend grew up that the king invited into his court these three scholars and asked them to debate which is the best religion. Had a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jewish person come in and debate which is the greatest religion. And so the story goes, the debate goes on, and at the end of the day, the Jewish person gave the strongest argument, so that's why the king chose to follow the Jewish religion. That's the tradition, or that's the legend that was used. And so Halevi takes that ancient story, and he uses as a premise to treat the different religions of his day, the different philosophies of his day, and in his mind point out why the Jewish tradition was superior to all the others. And so here's a quote from that. I gave it to you here. It says, "I was asked to state what arguments and replies I could bring to bear against the attacks of philosophers and followers of other religions, and also against Jewish sectarians who attack the rest of Israel." So this is kind of an apologia. It's a defense of the Jewish faith. And so he writes this work in this philosophical way. And out of that, you kind of come up with some basic teachings there that are going to present themselves again later in Jewish thought in the medieval world and early European world. And so it'd probably be interested to see this. What he's arguing as you watch the Jewish philosopher debate these other religions in this work. And by the way, there are English translations on that. You can go out online if you're interested and just look up the Khazari, and you can find English translations of that debate. Read it for yourself. It's quite interesting. Just be prepared. It is a bit tedious to follow, but it is interesting to read. So here's some big takeaways. This is just stuff I put together. I'm sure a bunch of people would summarize it differently, but those, as I look through it, these are kind of the highlights I pull from it. One, there is this belief that Judaism is based on divine revelation, and divine revelation supersedes mere human reason. So part of his argument is always that this is God's truth, and God's truth supersedes human reason. It predates, it comes before, it's superior to human reason. So that's why Judaism is, some of these other faiths, they would argue, have human reason built in. Jewish tradition came first, and it was far superior, and it was seen by many more people, and it is obviously divine revelation as opposed to the others. And he also has this belief that one day, he gets this from the prophets, one day all these other religions will eventually return to Judaism anyway. Judaism was first among these other three, of all three, against these other two. Judaism was first, and so Halevi argues it will also be last. At some point, you will return to it because it just is superior wisdom. And then his argument what does that mean with regard to the Jewish people today? Well, it's faithfulness. He says, notwithstanding their challenged worldly status, the Jewish people must remain a witness to God's revelation passed on in an unbroken tradition. So he saw the value of the Judaism that he was a part of, the value of the oral law. It was that this revelation of God has been passed down in an unbroken tradition from the beginning. And the role of the Jewish people is to pass that revelation down from generation to generation so the world at large would see it as a testimony and witness to which they one day succumb, because the truth will out. And so that's his view of the Jewish position. And lastly, he says, the Jewish people have this almost biological trait, this divine element. There is something that God programmed into the Jewish people to be able to understand his revelation. Because the question comes up, if this is God's revelation, why doesn't everyone accept it? Why doesn't everybody just see the truth? And he says, well, part of God's creation tendency is to build this divine element into almost the biology of the Jewish people, so they're receptive to the divine revelation. And this is part of the world returning one day to Judaism, is that they will receive the same divine element so that they could understand and receive this truth. So this is kind of one of the early treatments where you see Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, taking on philosophy. Now, it's not the first, it's not the only. I mean, when I was back in graduate school, I actually did a whole 3-hour exam on a fellow by the name of Philo of Alexandria, who was a contemporary of Jesus. And he was somebody arguing for philosophy, the harmony of philosophy and Judaism. So Halevi was certainly not the first. But in this medieval world where philosophy begins to be more important, this is kind of one of the early representatives who tried to build this bridge somehow between Judaism and philosophy. And his way of building that bridge is to say simply straight out, Judaism is superior to philosophy. It informs and it goes beyond anything that philosophy could do. Well, rushing ahead here, there are many major thinkers, but we probably have to talk about maybe the greatest known medieval Jewish rabbi slash philosopher called Maimonides, known often by his moniker Rambam. He is by far the most famous and the most enduring of all these teachers. If Rashi is known as the fundamental coder that goes on, Moses is the one that kind of synthesizes and brings it all together in a whole different level. In fact, there's a saying in some Jewish circles, from Moses, that is the original Moses, to Moses Maimonides, from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. And so Maimonides is the second of those. He's that important in the history of Jewish tradition. So again, a philosopher, but also a physician. He made his money in different ways, as a merchant for a while, then as a philosopher. Just his story goes on. As a physician, it said he goes and he works all day as a physician in the city, even the Muslim court, and then he'll turn around and go all the way back and minister as a physician to his local village, and then he would teach in yeshiva and family, and then at night after everybody go to sleep, he'd study Talmud. It's just another one of those indefatigable scholars who just wouldn't give up and stayed up all night studying. So just prodigious, just amazing amounts of writing, just puts all of us to shame. Just constant number of books, and I don't even know how many, but we'll look at kind of the 4 most famous works of Maimonides that kind of standardize Judaism for a lot of folks. One is a so-called Book of the Commandments. Now, in the Talmud, there's this statement that there are 613 commandments in the Torah. If you read through the Torah, according to the Talmudic scholars, there are 613 commandments. And scholars would repeat this, rabbis would repeat this, but the question came up, shouldn't we look those up? Shouldn't we list those? What are those 613, all those thou shalt nots or thou shalt? Go back to the Torah, list those out, what are they? And so different scholars in this period of time began to go back through the Torah and list them out. What are the 613 commandments that we must keep according to the Torah? Well, Maimonides did this. He went back through and he found 248 positive and 365 negative, and he made this list and he spelled them out. This was one of the first times. It had been done by a few others, but Maimonides became the most famous one of these. And so people finally knew, what are all the laws we have to keep? And so it created this whole new academic industry. Now everybody could fight about whether 612 and 613 were two separate or the same, and you start fighting over how do you get to this number. But the truth is, now at last, all these pages and pages and pages of Torah and Talmud, if people just debate over years, Maimonides simply came along and said, who's supposed to understand this? How is this going to be understandable to the average person? How are they going to put this together? And so he just kind of lists out these 613 commandments so you can see clearly these are the things God expects you to do. So you thought there were only 10, and you found those difficult. All right? It turns out there's 613 that you're supposed to be following. So you study those and you try to bring your soul and your mind in alignment for those. So Maimonides pulls these together and puts them in codified form. The other thing he does, for which he got into all kinds of trouble, is he puts together what's called the Mishneh Torah. This is another one of those services he felt that you just needed, because the problem is, again, the Talmud, it's teaching on any particular subject, marriage or sacrifice or divorce. It's spread through all the Talmud. So he just basically went through and said, well, it's time to kind of categorize this stuff and index this stuff and pull it together and put it in some kind of systematic organization so that you can find something. And so the scholar that he went through all the Talmud and began to pull together what is called the halakha, the legal portions of the Talmud. And he put them into these 14 books, arranged them in topical order so that if you wanted to really know what the Talmud says about this subject or that, finally there was a way for you to go and get this. And this is available now. You can go out and read it again. It's in all kinds of different translations. You can find it and work through it. But for the time, this was a very, very shocking thing to do. I mean, he got into a lot of trouble from the rabbis doing this, the conservative rabbis. Who do you think you are? Like for thousands of years, people just talked, for at least 1,000 years, and then a couple hundred before that, while the Mishnah was being put together. And so for 1,500 years, I said thousands, probably for 1,500 years, this is the way we did things. You just discussed the Talmud, and people learned it this way. Who do you think you are that you can come and take this book that's been discussed and written and passed down? Who do you think you are that you can just take and start grouping this stuff together? And what really aggravated, there were no footnotes. Like he didn't really go in and trace all the sources and say, well, this came from here, he just summarized what was going on, and here are the teachings. And so it really annoyed the traditional rabbis of the day, and yet it's still used today. The Talmud is such a formidable corpus of information. People still use this tool today to try to get a handle on what is the essential laws and rules that govern how we should live. In fact, here's a quote from his introduction. He says, "Therefore I have called this text Mishneh Torah, the second to the Torah." That's what got him in trouble too. In other words, up until this point, the Talmud is the second to the Torah. The Torah is the written law. That's second to the Torah. And kind of Maimonides just says, as a matter of fact, now this book is meant to be second to the Torah. What do you mean? You don't need the Talmud anymore? And basically that's what he's saying. Just set that aside. That's a big compendium of stuff. Just put that aside and just use my book because it really summarizes everything you need to know. Needless to say, he got himself in trouble. But he says, I have called this text the Mishneh Torah, the second to the Torah, with the intent that a person should first study the written law, the Torah, and then study this text and comprehend the entire oral law from it without having to study any text between the two. All right? So he basically said at this point, set the Torah aside, just read my book. It'll summarize everything you need to know. Very courageous dude. But the thing is, he was smart enough to get away with it because when you ask him questions, he knew the Talmud better than anybody. He was just saying to the average person, you don't need to know it all. I'll just give you the high-level summary. That's all you really need to know to get these various discussions. So that's another famous work. The other thing, interestingly enough, he puts together, and again is still around, what are called the 13 foundations of Judaism. What's interesting now, if you think about it, is we're now several thousand years in of Jewish history from Abraham on. And where along that list is there a list of beliefs? Even in the Old Testament, as we see it, or in the Tanakh, as the Jewish people would see it, there's no listing and say, here are the things we believe. Nobody ever stopped to write it down and says, well, what does a Jewish person actually believe? Can we list out the statements? Where's the statement of faith for Judaism? Well, humana. It's nowhere really. I mean, it's in the Bible. It's in the Torah. It's in the Talmud. It's woven through, and we just kind of know. But Maimonides says, okay, you're trying to train people what to think. What do we think? What is the statement of faith that we're going to use for Judaism? So Maimonides is one. So well, let's write it down. I mean, what do Jewish people believe? And so in many Jewish circles today, yeshivas and others, I mean, this is still taught. Like if you want a summary statement, what do the Jewish people believe? So I wrote them down for you here, and you can see them in your text. God is the creator of all that is. God is one. God is incorporeal. And this is in a day where we're still trying to sort through all the philosophies, whether God has a body or doesn't have a body. What kind of God is it? Philosophy, Greek philosophy. Is he have a spiritual body? Well, Maimonides, no, he's incorporeal. He doesn't have a body in any sense. God is eternal. He's separate from time. He's beyond time. God alone is to be worshipped. That's the hard lesson of the exile. They learned the hard way. Don't worship other gods. God said for thousands of years, don't worship other gods, don't worship other gods, don't worship other gods. They kept worshiping other gods. God finally took away their temple, took them to Babylon and said, now, do you get my point? Don't worship other gods. That was kind of the end of idolatry in Judaism. So they had learned by now. God alone is to be worshipped. God communicates to humanity through the medium of prophecy. So, avowing this role of the prophet. Moses was the greatest of the prophets to whom God communicated most directly, placing that supremacy of Moses as the starting place for revelation. Torah, the Pentateuch, was revealed to Moses by God, and Torah will not be supplanted by another revelation from God. So, remember, this is written after Islam has come into the picture. The Quran has already been written by this point. Maimonides is making the point there's nothing beyond the Torah. I mean, by that he means all the Tanakh, not just the 5 books of Moses, but all the Tanakh. It's not going to be supplanted by another revelation, i.e. the Quran, or i.e. the New Testament. In the Jewish world, the Torah, the Tanakh, if you will, that is the final revelation. God knows the actions of human beings and is concerned about them, so it's not a disjointed God, it's not a deistic God, it's a God that's engaged, it's a personal God who is engaged in reality. There is this idea that God rewards and punishes people for their good or evil ways. So this God has a moral expectation, and that you will be judged or rewarded depending on how you act. And then there is this explicit declaration that Messiah, the anointed one, descended from the lineage of David, will establish the Messianic age. So an explicit declaration of Messianic belief. Now, we're going to find forms of Judaism where that is questioned. You remember even in the days of the Pharisees and Sadducees, there was some debate among the Sadducees believing that. But traditional Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, Maimonides is saying, no, you believe in a Messiah, which, incidentally, according to Judaism in the Middle Ages, has not come yet. as opposed to Christians who at that time obviously believed the Messiah came in the person of Jesus. Maimonides is saying, no, we're still waiting for the Messiah, the anointed one, to come. And then in this battle over Sadducees and Pharisees over the resurrection of the dead, Maimonides says the Pharisees are right, the rabbis are right, there will be a resurrection from the dead. So this is, shockingly, you might think, one of the earliest instances where a rabbi finally said, what is it that we Jews believe? Let's put it down in one place so that we can teach it and instruct our young people. Because this becomes one of the problems, right, where this diaspora is spread all over the medieval Mediterranean world. What are you going to teach your children? How are they going to learn this? Not all of them know Hebrew. And so you got to write some of the stuff in Arabic because that's the lingua franca of the day. That's what people spoke. So you have to write this stuff so they can understand it. And so Maimonides is trying to put that in their hands. But there's also a deeper side to Maimonides, a philosophical side, and this is his last work, called The Guide of, or The Guide for the Perplexed. There's different translations. There's somewhat of a debate about how this ought to be translated. And so it's a very interesting work. It kind of is written almost like a private tutorial for a seeker. A young man trying to understand, trying to reconcile the difficulties of the Talmud and the Torah with the realities of philosophy, and he's trying to explain to him how these two partner and dance with one another, and you can kind of embrace one or the other. And unlike the rest of his works that he writes to be very clear and very precise and very simple, very straightforward, so that there's no mistaking what it is he wants you to know and understand, this work is very confused and very confusing. And it turns out that's exactly the way he wanted it to be. There's different levels of this work, so that the average person consuming it would say, oh yeah, he seems pretty orthodox to me. I mean, he seems pretty straightforward. I mean, he believes all the traditional stuff. But if you dig deeper and really read between the lines and see what he says, and you start to put it together, it turns out he wasn't quite as straightforward as you might think. He raises some interesting controversial ideas, and scholars that are a lot smarter than I am have worked through that, and they find some different attitudes to philosophy than what we found in Halevi. Halevi was like very emphatic about divine revelation trumping human reason. But it turns out Maimonides had a much more greater tolerance for the tension between these two and the unity that ultimately should be found between human reason and divine revelation. So, for example, this point that faith should not be blind, it should rest on reason. So kind of the opposite, really, of Halevi. And Maimonides actually, from what I understand, sometimes criticizes Halevi in terms of the way they think. In his mind, reason and faith are the same. Faith should not be blind. You just don't take a blind leap. That your reason can sort that through. And so, extending from that, truth is truth, no matter where it's found, even in its other religious traditions. Maimonides grew up in this so-called golden age of Spanish philosophy. There was a brief period of time there where Judaism, Christianity, and Islam kind of worked together, where there's this brief period of time where the scholars could kind of join together. And so in that heyday, where there's this brief collaboration between the thinkers, at least on these three levels in Spain, this idea that there's truth in Christianity, there's truth in Islam, there's truth in Judaism, because truth is truth. All truth is God's truth, regardless of where you find it. So a much more tolerant attitude to some of these other faiths than came out in the surface, all right, of his writing. Now, if you dig deeper into this Guide for the Perplexed, you can see that he had some tolerance there for looking for truth in these other traditions. There's also this kind of tendency in Maimonides in this work to kind of qualify or interpret, if you will, the supernatural elements of the text. The ones that appear most antithetical and most difficult for human reason to accept. There's a tendency to want to play down the supernatural side and try to understand them in a more natural way. For example, this whole idea about God being angry and wrathful. He would say God really doesn't have emotions. The scriptures speak of God's anger to compel obedience. So there's always, yes, the scriptures speak as if God is angry, but you need to understand God isn't really angry because God doesn't have emotions, because he doesn't have a body. He's not subject to all the passions that we have. So when the Bible says that, it's really just trying to have an effect. It's not saying who God is in his essence. It's just saying how God reveals himself so that it has an effect on us. That seems to be what Maimonides is saying. And so, for example, he has a problem with explicit reference to angels and demons. He says they don't really exist as such. They're more biblical metaphors for the forces of nature that are for or against us. And notwithstanding in his 13 foundations saying prophets carried this special revelation, behind the scenes in this Guide for Perplexed, it seems like he backs off that a little bit and says prophets don't really carry a special revelation. They demonstrate exceptional reason. So for that reason, Maimonides has no problems with saying, for example, that Aristotle is really a prophet, because he had a supernatural ability to see things. And that really, in the Middle Ages, you had this tremendous renaissance, especially in the Spanish Golden Period, and then later you would have this belief, this resurrection of Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle. And Aristotle becomes this whole new source, and whole forces of theology are now being written to try to reconcile the classics of Aristotle with traditional belief. And so Averroes in the Muslim tradition, Maimonides here in the Jewish tradition is trying to blend the teachings of Aristotle with the teachings of Judaism, Averroes with Islam, and later St. Thomas Aquinas would take some of this and try to blend the teaching of Aristotle with the teaching of Christianity. And so Aristotle was kind of a big topic in those days, a new genius, rediscovered. And so Maimonides tries to see that. In fact, it's interesting, Maimonides is actually quoted oftentimes by St. Thomas Aquinas. So great was this man's scholarship when it came to the study of Aristotle. So you can see there's this other side of Maimonides. On the one hand, he's this great mind that standardizes and establishes the baseline for people to follow Jewish tradition. But on the other, he has this other side, this philosophical side, this questioning side, maybe even a little antinomian side that says, I'm not going to follow all the rules. I'm not going to follow all the traditions. I have some honest questions here. So anyway, that's a very brief and insufficient summary of one of the greatest thinkers in Jewish history, Maimonides. There's another couple of speakers we want to talk about in this whole production of new literary genre or new spiritual works, and it has to do with the codification of the law. How do we actually manage ourselves with this huge Talmud, with all this halakha? I mean, it's great that Maimonides actually listed out and put in summary form this Mishnah Torah, but could we codify it even more? Can we just set up a law book so we know what the law is on all these different subjects? And so you have a couple folks come together and put that together. I mentioned here Joseph Caro, one of the works called in English the Set Table. It's still used today, it's still referred to today, it's still a standard today. Just trying to pull together all those different Jewish laws to a law code. And for some reason I had an out-of-body experience, and I put these two in, not in chronological order. Before him, Jacob Ben Asher puts together what's called in English the Four Rows, the Turim or the Tur. This is actually, he writes this, and then Joseph Caro actually, somehow my slides got out of order here, but Joseph Caro actually comments and builds on the work of Ben Asher, who puts together the Tur. And I won't go into detail into those. It's another whole level that we don't have time for. But I do want to just let you know that a couple folks were working on even further codification of the Talmud. Let's bring it down in such a way that people can actually understand it and put it together. So, big picture, this second millennium from 1000 to 700 or 1700, big period of time for the codification, the systematization, the clarification, summarizing of the Jewish literature up to that time. Give us some material that can be used in the diaspora scattered all over the known world. Okay. Another significant part of this 700 years of Jewish history, and we'll have to, I'm looking at the time, we'll have to buzz through this a little bit, but hopefully we can get through most of it. The other thing that's going on is that's encouraging this diaspora and this spread of Judaism all over the known world is that the persecutions and the expulsions don't stop. You remember last time we talked about how Christians were just brutal to the Jewish tradition for all kinds of reasons, unjustifiable, I might say. They were just brutal in terms of their oppression and persecution of the Jewish people. The Muslims also persecuting the Jewish people. General consensus, Jewish people did better under Muslims than they did under Christians, but neither place was a picnic, all right? Both of them were getting oppressed. Well, that oppression continues and gets even more severe in this period after 1000. And we're going to take a little bit of a look at that because I want us to see that there is a tendency in the Christian tradition to look at these other faiths and begin to get pretty judgmental and pretty harsh and pretty fierce. And all the way through the medieval period and the patristic period and the medieval period, Christians felt they were justified in how they treated the Jews because of the Bible, because of the New Testament, because of God's treatment. I mean, all kinds of reasons were given as to why they could be hateful and judgmental and oppressive to this other faith. And I just want us to be mindful of that, not because I want us to feel guilty. I mean, we weren't there. We didn't vote for any of this. But so that we don't repeat the same error. We don't repeat the same mistake. We're aware of the mistake of the ones who went before us and don't repeat it. So I'm bringing this up not to make us feel bad or not to be bad Christian. You know, I'm not doing that. It's a different era, a different time. We went over that last time. You can't expect people in one age to have the same sympathies and viewpoint of people in another age. I mean, time progresses, values progress, and I get all that. But all of that to say we're not excused. We should look back and see mistakes that were made in history and vow not to repeat them. I mean, it's a simple point. So, when I go back into history, obviously the Christian world did not get high marks in the whole crusade thing. That was not one of the highlights in our glory, right? And the first crusade was especially damaging to the Jewish population. If you remember the story, in 1095, Pope Urban calls for the crusade. And it's because the Muslims have taken over Jerusalem, taken over the Holy Land. The Christians there are complaining that their hegemonies, their businesses, their homes, and so forth were taken over. And so Urban II issues this call to go take back the Holy Land for the Christians. And so there are these large numbers of crusaders that are recruited, particularly in the Rhineland and so forth, to go and, or throughout the empire, but mainly marching now through the Rhineland, they head to Jerusalem on this journey. Well, it turns out that they were not nice on their journey. As they proceeded through the Rhineland, for whatever reason, they thought they were going to get started on the crusade early, started to be in their angry mode of judging those that did not believe. And so as they went through the Rhineland, they killed large numbers of Jewish people on their way to the crusade. They're not even there. They're just marching to get their ship to the crusade and just create these large-scale massacres in the Rhineland on the way to the crusade. And then when they get to Jerusalem, they just are savage about execution. They kill large numbers of Muslims and Jews alike. And so for generations to come, it's looked back, this first crusade is looked at as just this horrific event. Though ostensibly supposed to be supported by the papacy, it ended up creating all this loss of life for the Jewish people as they proceeded to take back the Holy Land. So anyway, just a reminder of that. Well, while that was going on, and as it continued in medieval, there was a number of kind of themes that repeated themselves in terms of anti-Semitism throughout this period. Stories that got repeated in the literature over and over again that were used as excuses to oppress and expel Jews from different towns and different cities. One of them is this so-called blood libel. It starts out in the Jewish community in Norwich, England. A young boy named William dies, and no one can explain why this young boy died. And this rumor began to develop that it was because the blood was taken out of William and used in religious rituals in the Jewish faith. Just in their private rituals, in their synagogues, they were using children's blood. Well, I mean, obviously no basis for it whatsoever. It's just one of those silly rumors that get started, and people just want to blame somebody for the death of this child. And so the rumor started to spread, and then it started to spread up in other cities and in other towns and in other places, and even throughout Europe, this belief, this assumption that Jewish people use the blood of murdered children in their secret rituals. Just no proof whatsoever, just a repeated accusation that was made. And really then you get the Jewish people totally expelled from England, and by the time of 1290 they're just kicked out of the country. So get out. And for almost 400 years, a little short of 400 years, 350 years, they're expelled from the country of England. They're not allowed to be there officially. Some sneak in, but officially they're not allowed to be in England. I mean, just started with a rumor. And you have, here's I gave you a picture of a kind of a carving, or I mean an imprint on a roll from the 13th century where Satan is seen to be in league with the Jews of this period. Just horrible, horrible belief, but just written out there. Another, a little bit later, another rumor of this type gets spread throughout this period, and this is a 15th century woodcut. This showing this so-called host desecration. The idea is that that the hosts for communion are taken, and the blood is placed in those. And so there's this idea that they're poisoning, the Jewish people are poisoning the host so that when you take communion, being poisoned. Just a terrible, terrible rumor that's spread around that that's the reason for the sickness and the death. It's because the Jewish people have poisoned the host. And again, no proof, but the rumor that is used to chase people out of towns and blame people for sicknesses, a lot of sickness in the Middle Ages, a lot of diseases flowing through the towns. Why not blame the Jewish people and blame it on the communion that people are taking? So, and then you get to this official persecution here in the Fourth Lateran Council. These are, you go back and look through this Roman Catholic Council, and there are actually rules in there about what Jews can and cannot do. One of the complaints is because Christian law didn't allow people to lend at interest, the Jewish people became a way that people could borrow money. And they did exact interest, and quite honestly, sometimes it was quite high interest. But Christian folks began to complain to their overlords that they didn't want to pay interest, and sometimes they couldn't pay it back, and so they began to complain. So the Church Council, the Fourth Lateran Council, declares that they should not be allowed to charge these interests. It kind of gave this license to Christian leaders to say, okay, you don't have to pay the loan back then. It's exorbitant interest. You don't have to pay the loan back. And so they just, oftentimes, with the right authority behind you, you can just say, sorry, you don't get your money. You tried to extort money from us. This is where you begin to have the distinctive dress, the star, and other things required in different areas for Jews and what they call Saracens, basically Muslims. That separate dress, separate star, something in your clothing to distinguish you. You have to wear that in certain cities and places. There's this law about Jews not appearing in public on Passion Sunday, the Holy Week. They're not allowed to come out. They have to stay in their homes. I mean, it's just a silly law, but this kind of gives you a level of the institutional hatred for Jewish people during this time. The prohibition of public office. No Jewish person could hold public office. Jews who have been baptized cannot be allowed to return to their former rite. There was a lot of forced conversion during this time. The idea that if you convert to Christianity, we won't make you go through all these, but a lot of times those conversions were superficial. They just kind of, you did it, you go along to get along, and then you went back to your Jewish home and did whatever you wanted. Well, the Fourth Lateran Council says no more. Now, keep in mind, the Fourth Lateran Council is just the church council saying these things true. Just because they say it doesn't mean it happens. The individual church communities and individual overlords and political figures had to enforce these things. But this, at any rate, gives you a statement of what the church thinks ought to take place in this period. Well, not surprisingly, all this bad press, all these terrible rumors, all this anti-Jewish legislation kind of gets washed out and burned out and pushed out in all kinds of different ways. And what you end up is this massive expulsion and resettlement campaign that was just for centuries just spewed Jews here and there all throughout the entire region. And this is just one map that I found that kind of lists those out. All kinds of different years in the Middle Ages, people just getting, Jewish people just getting kicked out of one region after another. And they had to go find another place to live for a while. In some case, they'd be invited back. So massive movements around. And you can see kind of over on the right side, on the eastern side north, you'll see a lot of those arrows start to point into Poland. You see that? While all this expulsion was going on in the Middle Ages, in Poland, the area we now know as Poland, there was a pull effect going on. The leaders there were starting to get organized, and the economy was in really rough shape. And the Polish overlords began to actually invite Jewish people to come into Poland. And so they brought their businesses in to help them run their estates. The people in Lithuania in the north were calling these Jewish people in to run their estates in the south. And so you actually have a pull effect. While there's a push effect in Western Europe out of cities and villages and towns and kingdoms, there's a pull effect over here in Poland saying, come here, we need you. And so there's this large Jewish population of Ashkenazi Jews. Remember, we said that the Ashkenazim, they start off kind of in this France, German area, and then begin to migrate east. Well, this is that area. They begin to migrate east. And so into Central and Eastern Europe, you have this huge population of Ashkenazi Jews. And it's in Poland, you have the leaders actually pulling the Jewish people in, saying, come here, help us with the economy. And that went great for a while. But you began to get some tension here, because what was happening is, while the lords and overlords and landowners were asking the Jewish people to come in, the common people were not so happy. Because, A, they began to take some of the jobs and some of the trades and so forth away from the common people. The other thing that happens is the overlords began to use the Jewish people to exact taxes and other things out of the people in their lands. And so now the local people were starting to see Jewish people as kind of hand puppets of the landlords that lived in Lithuania. And so while on the one hand it was great because they had a new land where people actually wanted them, the truth is not everybody in the new land wanted them. And whereas we're going to see there's tensions that develop in that Eastern Europe zone. But in any way, there was a place, and this is where you began to see that influx of Judaism into Eastern and Central Europe. Also during this time, you have a couple examples where you actually have burning of Talmuds going on in some cities. So just more persecution, Christians going to different leaders and saying, hey, you wouldn't believe the terrible things in the Talmud, allegations that Jesus is in the Talmud and is being treated, and blasphemous things are spoken about Jesus. And of course, the Talmud's in Hebrew, so the average leader, how are they supposed to believe any of this? It just depends who tells what. And so You have different folks going in and making accusations that Jesus is desecrated, Mary is in the Talmud being desecrated, none of which is true, by the way, but the allegations were being made. So you have this various cases, and there, I just noted two. There are a lot of cases apparently, and at different levels, but these are two notable cases that occurred in this period. This is also the beginning of the Middle Ages. It's also the beginning of the so-called ghetto. This idea that there is a place where you have to go and stay. And this is kind of one of the first official mentions. I mean, there's a debate about when ghettos started and, you know, when they actually became known as ghettos, but this is one of the first ones in the 16th century in Venice where it kind of became common practice. The Jewish people had to live in this place. You can see there's a little map there in Venice where they were forced to live. And in various places across Europe, Jews were forced to only live in this section. And different ghettos had different rules and different restrictions. Some of them were walled off so that people couldn't leave. There were usually curfews in effect. They weren't allowed to leave the ghettos. Oftentimes, sanitation and water and those kind of things were not great in those areas. So different rules, but you begin to see this ghettoization of the Jewish community in different places, and obviously that's going to be important when we get to the area of the Holocaust and so forth. We're going to see where those ghettos become objects of persecution. And in this case of the ghetto in Venice, the gates were walled off. There was gates put there and not even removed till 1800. I mean, for 200, 300 years, that ghetto remained in effect. And just to add to the wonderful tradition of Christian generosity towards Judaism, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that wonderful event called the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition was kind of a general term that was used of people researching, or not researching, people inquiring after and making inquiries into a person's religious belief and treatment and laws and so forth. Well, you have the particular one that affected the Jews most severely is this Spanish Inquisition in the late 15th century. This is the same famous Ferdinand and Isabella decide that to bring an end to all that golden age where Jews and Muslims and Christians got along and worked together. Well, now we come to an end of that, and the Christian era is going to kick in, and so there are these decrees in 1492, 1502, basically ordering Jews and Muslims to convert, and if they converted, they could not convert back. They had to leave. They couldn't produce things, or they couldn't go back and live the way they used to. They had to totally leave their other communities and be entirely converted. Many Jews did. I don't know numbers, but many Jews did, and the question is, now creates a whole theology problem for Judaism. What happens to those folks that convert under duress? Are they anathema? Are they now going judged by God, or should they let it back in? This had been going on. This isn't just in the 15th century. This has been going on for some time. Rabbis debated whether you should let folks back in and so forth, or whether they're excluded. So big problems from a theology standpoint, but while many Jews did convert, many more left. And so this was all a result of that Inquisition. And lest we think only the Catholics were the problem, we need to be reminded that the founder of the Protestant Church, Martin Luther, who I love, who is like probably one of my top 3 theologians of all time. I love Martin Luther and all he did. But one must not look at him with rose-colored glasses. You have to understand that he had his bad side as well. And he wrote this terrible book, really, against the Jews and their lies in 1543. Unfortunately, he was sucked into the whole anti-Semitism of the day as well. So it's not as if the Protestants were altogether pure with regard to their treatment of Jewish people either. Again, all of this persecution, just looking at the last few slides here, I see we're getting close to our end, but I did want to finish up this presentation. We already mentioned this part, that a lot of this uprising, a lot of this expulsion material actually drew people into Poland. That's basically what I point out in this slide. And but that doesn't go well forever and ever. I told you it creates a tension with local folks, and eventually you have this group called the Cossacks that rise, kind of a popular uprising to push back against the overlords, and the Polish people get caught in the middle of that uprising, and large numbers were killed in Poland. So while for a brief period of time they had a little bit of period of prosperous period there in Poland, short-lived as the Cossack popular movement uprises, and they see the Jewish people as just instruments of the overlords, the Lithuanian, mostly Lithuanian overlords, and they just overcame them. And then, of course, just because in the midst of all these other problems, you have your own internal problems, and just, I thought it might be interesting for Christians to know that in the midst of all this, there's an unsuccessful Messiah that interjects himself. Was Sabbatai Zevi, comes on the scene in the 17th century, proclaims himself the Messiah, and what's interesting is the way he develops quite a large following of people internationally, and creates a great following, and he becomes convinced that he needs to go to Constantinople and declare to the emperor and declare to everyone that he's the Messiah. He's convinced to go there. The only problem, he goes to Constantinople and they put him in prison. They weren't too willing to accept him. And as the story goes, that was not what he wanted, so he converts to Islam. There goes the Jewish Messiah. He's now a Muslim. So that didn't go too well. But I thought it might be interesting for you to see, these false messiahs, they pop up from time to time, even into the Middle Ages. Okay, that's the end of this presentation. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll take questions. Father, thank you so much again for this story. It's a hard story to listen to. It's embarrassing for those of us that claim the name of Christ to look at all the oppression that went on. And Father, our reason to look into that mirror is just to make sure we don't see ourselves there, that we don't fall into that trap of judging and hating and using the Scripture and all the rest as an excuse to oppress. That's not the way of your Lord. It's not the way of your kingdom. And so, Father, I pray that our lights might be illuminated by even these dark shadows, that we could see your light. And so, Father, we just ask that you would illuminate our ways to make it clear and reflect your glory truly. In the name of Christ Jesus our Lord, we pray.